I want to talk about unisons and octaves. They are classified in the perfect, augmented, and in the case of the octaves, diminished category. When we're talking about the quality of the intervals, not just the number, but the quality, what type of a octave, what type of a unison. So using your interval handout, if you look at just the section on intervals, take a look at that. And I'm going to write some unisons here, and I want you to, based on the handout, tell me what type of unisons I'm writing. Okay, I've got 3 examples here. Number 1, number 2, number 3. So the first question I want you to answer is, which one of the 3 is a perfect unison when you look at my definition? Which one is perfect? All right, so number 1, they're on the same line or space. So we know it's a unison, also written as a 1 if we're writing the number, and the octaves are written as an 8 if you want to write it that way. But when they're exactly the same, that is a perfect unison, a perfect unison. Now, look at number 2 and tell me what type of a unison I have here. And you should have come up with an augmented unison. If the 2 notes are on the same line or space, but they're a half step apart because of a sharp or a flat in front of one of the notes, this is an augmented unison. Number 3, augmented unison here? Yes. Logic might tell you this might be a diminished unison, but we don't have diminished unisons. This is another type of augmented unison called an inverted augmented unison. So the bottom line is you have 2 types of unisons, perfect, where they're exactly the same, or augmented, where they're a half step apart, but still a unison. Perfect or augmented. Let's look at octaves. I'd like you to use your keyboard picture while we're doing these octaves. And I've got the keyboard right here. Let's look at sort of a simple one here. Okay, we've got 3 types of octaves. So we count the number, and remember when as we're getting back into intervals, if one note is on a line and one note's on a space in an interval, it is an even number. The odd numbered intervals have both notes on a space or both notes on a line. So what type of an octave are you thinking we have here? Both notes are exactly the same, a perfect octave. So we can write P8 or we can write it POCT. That's also fine. When we talk about octaves, we never talk about them as 8s. We always use the word octave, but when we're writing it in theory work, it's fine to use the number 8. So when we look at the definition of octave or of augmented and diminished, when we're talking about intervals that can be perfect, augmented, diminished, augmented is a half step bigger than perfect, diminished is a half step smaller than perfect. So what I want to do is compare this one to this one. So let's see what perfect looks like by looking at our keyboard picture. Okay. And then what happens when I sharp the top note? If I move up here, I think you're gonna be able to see this better. I have a D here and a D here. And if I sharp it, do you see how I just made it bigger? It moved this way and became bigger. So perfect. So the sharp on the top means I made it bigger than perfect. This is called an augmented octave. Okay, augmented octave. Now, if I have a flat on the top, let's compare to perfect again, a D to a D. If I flap the top note, see how I'm moving this hand closer to my other hand, which means I'm bringing it in and making it a half step smaller than perfect. Half step smaller than perfect is called diminished. Now, when our bottom note doesn't have a sharp or a flat by it, it's very straightforward and even logical. But if there's a sharp or a flat on the bottom note, this is when it becomes less predictable. So let's move to the bass clef here and look at some of those. So I'm going to start with an A flat to an A flat. So think about, and notice I'm writing these as harmonic intervals for space, but they could certainly be melodic intervals. Like that, or let's see, I could do write it that way, and we're going to get the same answer on these. It is important with an octave, though, that your lowest note is always the note on your left on your keyboard picture. There we go. Okay, let's look at A flat to A flat. What type of an octave? If they're exactly the same note, but just an octave apart, it is a perfect octave. Now let's compare perfect to our second one, which means we have an A natural on the top. So watch, if I take away my flat up here, I move away from my other hand, which makes it bigger. So this one with the flat on the bottom is a diminished octave. So perfect, diminished is, augmented, sorry. So perfect, augmented, half step bigger. So an augmented octave here. When we have a sharp on the bottom, okay, let's look at A sharp to A sharp to compare our perfect interval, and then take the sharp away on the top. Notice I'm bringing the interval in closer to my other note, and this is a diminished octave. So if you have a sharp or a flat as your bottom note on the octaves, definitely check your keyboard picture. And the keyboard picture is the way I recommend figuring octaves out.